So, I have a short lecture here, don't worry, it's not going to be too long, about some of the brief history of Africa and the slave trade. So, now I said it's a brief history of Africa. Obviously, we don't have time to go into the whole history of Africa as a continent and the various different empires and peoples that were there, but I'm going to give us kind of a brief overview. And the most important thing here is to dispel this kind of myth of Africa as the dark continent. Now, Zinn already did this a little bit in chapter 2, drawing the color line, when he was talking a little bit about from the history of Africa. Africa had complex societies. They had universities, libraries, thriving intellectual culture. The university at Timbuktu was renowned throughout Africa. They wrote many, many books, some of those books which are still existing. There was monument building. They built large cities and monuments, some of which still exist. I mean, obviously, the biggest, most well-known ones are in Egypt. But even if we're looking at more kind of Western Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the areas that the slave trade would have been capturing people, there was monument building happening there as well. There is wealth, prosperity, high standards of living in Africa. Zinn talks about this a little bit as well, the cleanliness that we could find in African cities, that they actually would sometimes employ people to be cleaning up garbage, and they didn't have sewage running through the streets, as was common in many European cities. So, in some ways they were more developed than some European cities were. This is all kind of in contrast to the way that Africa would then be painted as somewhere where everyone was living in mud huts on the brink of starvation, and so therefore enslaving these Africans was actually kind of a good thing because it was saving them. So, as I said, Africa is home to Egypt. Sometimes I think we kind of forget that there were black pharaohs, that is part of that African kind of heritage. But that was not the only empire that existed in Africa. Now, this isn't the best map because it is condensing kind of centuries of history down into kind of one image. You can see some of the biggest, most powerful of the empires. And this area in Western Africa, these are the areas in which most of the enslaved people would be pulled from. And here, some of the biggest empires were the Mali, Ghana, and Songhai empires. Now, this is a slightly better map of this region because it is looking at it more, kind of giving us some dates. So you can see that there was the Ghanan Empire, and then once the Ghanan Empire fell, Mali kind of took over, and then the Songhai Empire built on top of that. So Mansa Musa here was a Mali emperor, and he is one of the most well-known of those West African emperors, largely because he went on Hajj. And if he's going on Hajj, most of you should know that that means he was Muslim. There was a large Muslim population in Western Africa. He went on Hajj to Mecca, and along the way distributed lots of gold and gifts, and it became quite a big kind of to-do. This is a atlas that was made in Europe, but you can see that Mansa Musa is depicted there. He has a gold gilded crown and scepter, and he's holding, I don't know if it's a coin or something, but it's very much displaying that wealth. Africa that whole region was known as the Gold Coast. It was a region that was perceived as wealthy. It's only later on that reputation starts to get undermined as people are wanting to justify the enslavement of Africans from that area. Here you see an example of West African architecture, some of the kind of building that was going on. So I had just kind of mentioned that West Africa was the area for the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. You can see that here, this Gold Coast area. This is where the majority of enslaved people are being taken from. The little forts and stuff you can see here in red, you can see where they're being taken. There's not that many going up to Europe because Europe isn't having those kind of plantation agriculture that ends up kind of needing slave labor in order to be the most profitable. See very large numbers coming into South America. We don't always think of South America as having a large kind of black population, I think. We're usually thinking more kind of Latino in those areas, but you can see very large numbers of Africans being brought into South America, being brought into the islands, right? Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and somewhat smaller numbers being brought to British North America, what would become the United States. You can also see at this time what was kind of laid out as the British colonies, the extent of some of the French colonies, the Spanish colonies, the Portuguese. The Dutch don't have that much. They actually were in New York for a time, here in South America a little bit as well. And you can also see some of the origin of the different Africans, right? This is starting to get into the idea that Africa was a giant continent, right? There were hundreds of languages and different religions, different cultural ideas, different practices. Africans did not identify themselves as Africans any more than we would identify ourselves as North Americans. Right? We tend to say we are American, meaning the United States of America, if that is indeed right, that we were born here. But we don't really say we're North American. So Africans didn't really have that kind of African identity. They were, defining themselves as, here we can see, the Yoruba or the Mandinka or the Mende. And they might have historically been enemies. Some of them were allies. Some of them were Christian. Some were Muslim. Some were various different pagan beliefs. And so Africa wasn't just one cohesive group of people. This is one of the kind of challenges for Africans once they get to the Americas, because they may be enslaved with people who are also African, but don't speak their languages at all. This is another map that's kind of showing some of these numbers. When we're looking at how many Africans were brought out of Africa, we can say somewhere around roughly 12 million Africans brought out of Africa. Now, that isn't counting all of the Africans that died on the marches to the coast. And then, of course, there were very high rates of death during the Middle Passage, which we'll be discussing. And so trying to keep track of what the numbers are exactly can be fairly kind of difficult. So somewhere around 12.5 million Africans, right, from 1525 to 1866 are taken from Africa. About 10.7 million arrived alive. That's a 14% death rate. So 14% of the Africans who were removed from the African coast died on that Middle Passage. Right? That's what we usually refer to the trip, the journey from Africa to wherever the ship was going in the Americas as the Middle Passage. And it tended to have this really horrifically high death rate. These numbers that I'm including here are all from the very comprehensive and continuing to grow and have more information in it Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. About 388,000 of those Africans arrived in North America. So only a relatively small fraction of all of the Africans involved in the slave trade ended up in North America and then in what would become the United States. So this is a kind of interesting chart because it is showing how many Africans, for example, were brought to Europe. Very, very small kind of numbers. Here we're looking at mainland North America. So you can see that their numbers aren't really starting until 1626, although we do know 1619 was when some of the first Africans were brought. I'm not sure exactly why that's not included here. You can see that those numbers are getting the highest here in 1751 to 1775, right up until the American Revolution, and then it kind of drops off. You can see numbers here in the Caribbean, really huge numbers. How many people are being brought to Spanish, American kind of mainland, in Brazil. How many were brought to other places in Africa, and then had other kind of destinations. So we can see kind of overall the height would have been 1800 to 1825 as the height of the slave trade. So the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was an extremely traumatic experience for Africans. It was very dehumanizing. They were being treated, without any kind of humanity or respect at all. It was very traumatizing to them. It removed them from culture, from friends. It leaves them vulnerable to that enslavement because they may be surrounded during the Middle Passage, and then once they get to, Jamestown, Virginia, or wherever else, they may be surrounded by no one who actually speaks their language. And sure, some of those other Africans might look similar to them, but they may have completely different cultural ideas and beliefs and practices, different religions, different language. And so that can make them feel extremely isolated, and it is more difficult for them to try to revolt and rebel, although they did. And there were some successful slave rebellions on ships in the Middle Passage. So what I'm going to have you look at after this, it's under the videos segment, is I want you guys to watch this about 7 to 8 minute clip from the longer movie Amistad. I included a little kind of write-up about what the Amistad is about, but it was the successful slave rebellion, and then there's basically a debate. Were these people legally kind of enslaved? Were they born in Cuba, as the people who are claiming to be their masters say? Or, as it seems somewhat more likely, because they don't know any Spanish, are these people actually from Africa? And therefore, by 1839, under U.S. law, would have been illegally enslaved, because the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage, was outlawed in the United States by 1808. Slavery continued in the U.S., but they could not import any new slaves. So Cinque is finally able to tell his story once they find a translator, and he kind of will show us there some of the horrors of the Middle Passage. I think it's a really powerful and kind of sobering clip to see, but also be prepared. There's nudity, there's quite a lot of violence, there's some sexual assaults, although it is not shown really kind of graphically, but it is a fairly disturbing clip. So go on and watch that, and then you can continue to go through the material for the week.